for today's session, which is from decolonisation to locally led development, repoliticising the agenda. So just really briefly in terms of what to expect as part of this plenary session. As Yamina mentioned earlier, we're really lucky to be joined by two brilliant speakers. We've got Dr. Kamna Patel and Dr. Lata Narayanaswamy, who will be helping us unpack some of these key terms, these big terms. And these big concepts, how they show up in our work, and some critical reflection time afterwards to really think through what this will mean for your work as well. We'll also really briefly share with you the work that GADN is doing on decolonisation, particularly through our Reframe programme, which is our on-premise reframing of macro-level economics. And there'll also be, as I said, an opportunity for you to ask the speakers some questions, pick their brains, and before we get into dedicated breakout groups where we'll discuss these questions a little bit further. But before I do introduce our speakers, I did want to briefly kind of set the scene for today's discussion and explain why it appears that this issue of locally led development is featuring considerably heavily across our work and has gained a considerable amount of traction as well across the sector, particularly over the question of decolonisation. So as we know, when global Black Lives Matter protests happened back in 2020, and Kamna alluded to that as well, there were a lot of statements that our organisations put out, a lot of commitments that were made, but the global protests at the time firmly put the issue of racial justice firmly on the global agenda. And I think it also then, for us, including in the international development sector, it opened up the space for discussions around how we decolonise development. And so, we've had, almost 4 years since then. So that discussion has developed, it has morphed, it has evolved over that time. So I think a lot of times, and listening to some of the things that many of you were saying as well in your member updates, it's what does this question of decolonising development look like? And I think, some of us have alluded to how we do our programme and design and delivery, how we look at our policy and advocacy priorities, how we are thinking about our internal HR practices, our communications work, as well as assessing the ways in which we're working with organisations across the global south. So there's all varieties of ways in which that decolonisation work is happening. And that's not to say that there's one set way, for sure. And I think it's interesting the different ways in which this work is evolving. But I think we're increasingly seeing now that this initial bold ambition to decolonise development is slowly morphing into calls for locally led development, or as many of you will have heard as well, shift the power. And a lot of times these two contexts or these two concepts are being used interchangeably, when in fact they're not the same thing. So I think most recently, many of you will have seen the International Development White Paper that was released by the government at the end of last year. And in particular, it outlined this really strong commitment to development partnerships that are based on mutual respect, and with a really strong emphasis on locally led development approaches. And I went through and I counted that there were 17 references to locally led development, admittedly in a 100-page paper, but not that many, but still more than you would expect to see. But of course, unsurprisingly, no references to decolonisation. So why is this, you might ask, and I'm sure we will all have our understandings about why that might be, especially when we think about that for centuries, of colonisation has been absolutely central to the ways in which the global economic system, global governance has been set up, and yet that question on how you work in mutual partnership with countries across the global south, the question of decolonisation is completely absent from the way in which the UK government understands how you build mutual relationships. So to think through these issues a little bit further, including unpacking some of these big concepts of locally led development and decolonisation, as well as their respective strengths and weaknesses, I'll go first to our first speaker, Lata. So Lata has already introduced herself very briefly, but I'll give you the full background because she really deserves it. So Lata is an associate professor in the politics of the politics of global development at the University of Leeds, and is also a GADN trustee. Her research critically reflects our gendered, intersectional, and post-decolonial dynamics of development knowledge and its perceived contribution to global development challenges. She's currently involved in applied interdisciplinary research related to climate change, water security, and decolonising development, which is very appropriate for today's conversation. And in late 2020, Lata was also part of a GADN Members Meeting where we addressed or looked at this question of addressing systemic racism and decolonising the international development sector. You can find that online. And she also wrote a GADN briefing, it was in 2021, titled Decolonising Aid. So all of those resources you can find on the GADN website as well. So I'll hand over to you, Lata.
Thank you so much for a generous introduction. It's such a joy to be here, and there's quite a few people that I've been connecting with online, particularly during the pandemic, and it's like, wow, you all have legs. So that's really, really nice. So actually, and I hope to get a chance to speak to as many of you as possible, certainly, and discuss all of these issues. Obviously, a huge thank you to GADN for inviting me to engage with all of you, but really importantly, to creating the opportunity to talk about these issues, to work with Kamna, which I've not had a chance to do for a long time. So all of this is a real privilege. So thank you so much. And it's great to see all of you interested in these issues. I was really excited to hear from your members' updates, because my feeling is that, just as you said, you know, the sound on localization is getting a little bit louder, even as the sort of the way we talk about decolonisation, that's all gone a little bit quiet. So I'm really grateful for GADN for creating this space, because I think we need to join these up together. We need to think through what the different opportunities and challenges of each of them are. Again, I got a good sense from your members' updates, which again, I really appreciate the detail. But just to avoid thinking that we were all sort of on the same page, I think it's useful to start with coloniality. And we can think about how these different vocabularies offer these different opportunities and challenges for our work. So if you could have the next slide, please. So in order to first recognize the nature of the challenges that we face. So whilst many of you are obviously recognizing the importance of colonialism and the harm that it caused, and there are people that think that, yeah, we can acknowledge that colonialism was bad, but on balance, you know, it was quite good, because, you know, that governance and the trains thing, you know, that was really quite good. We will still struggle to accept just how long a shadow coloniality casts on our present. So hopefully there are plenty of people in positions of power to remind us. So if I could ask you to just hit the video on this screen, please. So I don't know if you've seen this video before, but this is, so what he says first, let's tell you what he says first. So Europe is a garden. We have built a garden. Everything works. It is the best combination of political freedom, economic prosperity, and social cohesion that the humankind has been able to build. These three things together, the rest of the world is not exactly a garden. Most of the rest of the world is a jungle, and the jungle could invade the garden. Now, he goes on to say all sorts of other things around how the garden has to work with the jungle, and we can't build high walls and all these other things. But this is not somebody making a party political speech. That's the first thing. This is, in fact, the EU, one of the EU's most senior diplomats. So in theory, this guy's a bureaucrat. He's supposed to be politically neutral. And this is, for those of you who might, because you'll have seen them on the news more recently, this is Joseph Borrell. So he is the highest, he's the high representative of the European Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy. So he's one of the most senior bureaucrats in the EU, okay? And he associates himself with the Spanish socialist left. Now, so you may find some of that detail surprising, I did. But his comments are full of colonial tropes that reproduce the global north as the site of civilization and a flattened rest of the world that is barbarous. And interestingly, this was in fact the second time he'd given this speech, okay? But he got caught this time. And this time people picked up on the speech, and then he went on to apologize after the backlash. But it's important for us to consider the reason that he even said it and his surprise at the backlash, because he was caught off guard by the backlash. It is because in his mind, as in the mind of many others, this is not controversial at all, just part of our collective common sense to think about the world in this way. What should give us pause for thought is why it didn't occur to him or his assistants, who likely helped him to draft this speech, that his analogy was very problematic indeed. Okay, so we can move on to the next slide, please. So this brings us back to the question of colonialism. Are we on there? Great. Okay. So this isn't about focusing just on European colonialism. This is about understanding how coloniality is part of our everyday. Why we need to engage with decoloniality is not to undo the past. If we don't have a time machine, we can't do that. But rather to surface both what has been lost because of colonization, but also the dangers of focusing solely on a historical view of colonialism that tends to start and end with European empire. So scholars like Olufemi Taiwo makes a very compelling argument about why using terms like pre-colonial does precisely the opposite of what this term is meant to do. So that is, it strips formerly colonized nations of their own unique place in human history and thus their agency. And instead, it boils down their very existence into European colonial binaries. So I'm not saying we shouldn't talk about European colonialism, we absolutely should, but decolonization cannot start there. If we give in to North-South binaries mapped along the lines drawn by European colonialism, many important stories, and thus forms of both solidarity and agency, also get lost. So this includes African-descended minorities in Asia and Latin America, indigenous peoples in global North countries, or indeed the unequal power relations that colonialism has either seeded, supplanted, or amplified in a diversity of ways across the so-called global South that reproduce colonial power relations. And we'll come back to that in a minute. We'll also lose sight of the ways in which action is happening. So I've tried to capture some of that in some of these headlines, such as the declaration of republics by Caribbean nations, and very much against prevailing power relations and norms. So there is lots of this activity going on, both against the coloniality of our everyday, but also things that we don't tend to talk about in the space of development, like indigenous land rights in places like Canada and Australia. You could just click, please. So this is why the idea of neo-colonialism is so valuable. In short, we have to be mindful of decolonization being a new form of aid, or even white saviorism, that we do this to help others. But this also means reflecting carefully on what not just European colonialism has meant in our own contexts, or the effects on our communities, families, even our bodies, though this may be a reasonable place to start. Instead, drawing inspiration from this notion of neo-colonialism, we need to think about the effects of coloniality now. And this includes how we may be, however unwittingly, implicated in it. So we must sit with and reflect on the discomfort this position brings. And I think in this work, this is the hardest bit, right? It's that discomfort. It's thinking about how we're implicated. We don't do this work, and I include myself in this. We're in academia. We're not exactly, you know, coming up smelling of roses in the way that people were chasing after all the GCRF funding. That is what that is. And we have to work out, we're going to be part of the solution. It's important for us to be honest about how we might be part of the problem. Oh, goodness gracious. Okay, so next slide, please. So localization is happening, including in relation to gender equality and inclusion. So I've got a nice little, this is not me, if I was this clever technologically, I'd be doing something different. This is that lovely designer feature in PowerPoint, but you can see this image from a report on SDGs and local government reporting back on how they're localizing gender. So localizing gender equality and inclusion, as this report makes clear, these are the sorts of efforts that are happening. You guys are all describing things which I think sound really exciting. And this is, of course, a shared interest in particular around gender. So it is really worth reflecting then when we talk about, projects that are working on, gender and decolonization or gender and localization, it's useful to interrogate why we need to look at this idea more closely. Next slide, please. So I made this slide, not because you guys are all going to read it, but on the assumption that you're likely to share the PowerPoint at the end. So I've hyperlinked a whole bunch of resources that I think will be very helpful to you. These are all available open access. But really the only thing I want to say here is just to summarize sort of what these different reports are sort of telling us. And I think they're very helpful messages. So the first thing is that the local should not be separate to the global. I think that's a really useful lesson. We can't be seeing local, wherever that is, as separate to what's happening globally. Localization is a process, not an outcome, and thus, in my mind, overlaps really well with decolonization. And then there are a number of different terminologies associated with the local, right? So we can think about the different words that might signal the local, even if that's not the word that's being used. And localization is also contextual. So far, so sensible. And these are all ideas that we can quite easily engage with in our own work. Next slide, please. But what, as Sophie said quite rightly, is happening is that we are also getting this conflation. So to decolonize, we must localize. Next slide, please. And this raises some interesting questions for us, because it is possible that the quote unquote local to which aid has been decentralized is also highly unequal, which may in fact be replicating colonial power structures. So a focus on the local may address the broad north-south geographic or spatial or informational inequalities. That's fair enough, but may in fact, through the structural constraints, including a focus, for instance, on the need to use English language and associated knowledges, right? So the fact that we work in this space, I'm sure you've all had this experience, but I find I can just rock up to any space and I'm the only native English speaker and everybody is speaking English. I mean, we surely have to be interrogating that. There's something kind of wrong with that. I'm not sure what we do about it, but at least I can acknowledge that it's not entirely comfortable. But through these sorts of structural constraints, we can end up reproducing the colonial logic of a homogenous Black and brown other whose ideas, aspirations, and lived realities are not only perceived as entirely separate from our own in the global north, but are also indistinguishable from each other. So as a result, attempts to localize then become simply about adapting northern ideas to the local context and empowering only certain hand-picked, quote-unquote, local actors, invisibilizing and even silencing the diversity of other stakeholder groups and ideas that may exist in that context. So whilst localization can and should be part of dismantling North-South power imbalances, this strategy does nothing to address the structural concerns of aid itself, which perpetuates an image of the global South as underdeveloped and dependent on the global North. I would also argue that if we understand one imperative of decolonization as collapsing the us and them civilized barbarism binaries that Borrell talks about, and then challenging the prevailing power imbalances in the aid structures, then the danger of localization that focuses on where the money goes rather than broader structural concerns is that challenging unequal power in aid and development becomes their problem rather than ours, which is ironically an inversion of its supposed purpose. Okay, so to conclude, oh, did I not put that in? Sorry, that's one of the reports. Again, you can read that when the PowerPoint circulated. So where do we go from here? Which is why I think this is a great opportunity to, in a way, maybe not start, but restart the conversation. So maybe some of the things we might ask ourselves, we might start our deliberations through the lens of ethics. Who is best placed to undertake an inquiry or a task? How do I enable them to be involved? Am I or are we even the right people to be asking or answering this question in the first place? I also think we need to consider how we change the lens through which we define problems. Now, on the right of the slide here, you'll see a screen capture of a UNDP project with the city of Bogota in Colombia. Now, the funny thing is that this was a hybrid side event on last year's CSW. And what was so funny is that UNDP was sharing this because of the GIS element, you know, this kind of digital mapping stuff. That for me was the least interesting bit of it. I mean, the maps were quite pretty, but that was not what's interesting. What was interesting is that Bogota was interested in using the mapping. So this is about the application of the technology to map the city in relation to care. And this just seemed really simple, but really clever. So they wanted to understand their city differently by using the mapping tools to work out where people access care. So you map all the places in the city that offer care. And then you work out, and then you have a goal that says nobody should be 15 minutes of more than a 15-minute walk, I think it was, from a site of care, which seemed to me as a planning thing, like, yeah, count me in, that's fantastic. Let's center care, really good. But for me, it's a fascinating attempt to bring new perspectives to planning and reorienting what we value in our public and community spaces. So bringing localization together with decolonization has the potential to support us to move away from us and them conversations to collective deliberations about we and us solving shared problems. That's what I'd like us to do, to move beyond us and them to just us. So I will now turn over to Kamna, who will bring what I know to be, because I've seen her PowerPoint, fantastic insight into bridging theory into practice. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Lata. And I know there will be lots of thoughts and questions that we will be able to ask in the Q&A and in the breakout group later. And so next I want to introduce our second speaker, Dr. Kamna Patel, who is an associate professor at the Development Planning Unit at UCL. Her current research and field of practice concerns the relationships between race, understood as a racialized hierarchy of value, and development. This focus builds on 3 strands of research, which is housing, land, tenure, and citizenship in the urban global south, reflexive practice and post-colonial scholarship on teaching and practice of development, and application of a race lens to understanding and taking action for equity and justice. So between 2021 and 2023, she was also on secondment with Christian Aid as their principal advisor on race and diversity. And you may have heard her speak at our 2022 members meeting while she was in that role. So I'll hand over to you, Kamna.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. So thank you to Sophie, thank you to GADN for the invitation. Thank you to Lata. We had a pre-chat about what we're going to talk about today, and it was wonderful to have someone to bounce ideas from. So I'd also like to express gratitude to everyone in this room for also being that for us and for being that for one another as well. It's a really valuable thing to have. Oh, continue. Just continue. All right, I'm just going to... Instructing, right? Okay. All right. Should I lean into the microphone a little bit as well? So to me, when Sophie asked me told me what it is that she wanted me to speak about, I sat for a few moments with this idea of locally led. And to me, this word locally led is really, really evocative. And what makes it evocative is because for something to be locally led, it implies something else that isn't and someplace else that isn't. It's a term that only makes sense relationally. And I think we often forget or miss out, either through not thinking about it or deliberately, dare I say, what else is happening if something is locally led. So I want to unpack and illustrate the idea of the local as a particular scale that only makes sense in relation to other places by looking at examples of locally led development approaches in these different scales. And I'm aware of many different case studies. And in fact, when I knew that I was going to be speaking here, my dear friend Lena here suggested a report that I should read that had lots of examples of locally led practices. And I was looking through some of those, I was looking through others, and everything that got marked up as a good example of locally led development, and that evaluation of it being good, was because it tended to come from a local partner saying something about a locally led initiative that fed into a locally led localization agenda. Now, I've said the word local an awful lot, and I think that's the problem, because I think we're using it in different ways. The term local can be a reference to a territory. It can mean a place. The word local can also refer to people, the local. And when they're put together, it also gets marked up as a way to refer to particular kinds of knowledges that must be better knowledges than other kinds of knowledges because they come from a place. That's a lot of burden to put on the word local without unpacking any of it. So like I said, the local is a scale and it only makes sense in relation to other scales. So from the many different examples, the one that I'm going to focus on is direct cash transfers. I'm going to look at direct cash transfers as an example of locally led development at multiple scales. And the reason why I'm using it is because I figure that everyone in this room knows what that means and has some experience of it. And if you don't, and you don't like the example, then I think the point that I want to make still works if you substitute that for something else that you do regard as locally led development. Okay. So I want to briefly go through 4 examples of direct cash transfers at different scales. I'm so sorry. I figured that I'd be doing it, and so I put in lots of pop-ups. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, can you do this?
Oh, okay.
Hopefully it will work.
Yeah. Okay. Shout out to Christian Aid. That's my first example. And oh no, it should go. How do I go back? That's it. Thank you. So the first example I want to look at is a Christian Aid example, and it's their work on humanitarian cash transfers. And I know Christian Aid is not the only organisation that does this, but under its survivor and community-led response approach, this is an approach that brings together or aims to bring together cash, localisation, and the participation agenda of the grand bargain. And so in this example, individuals, specific individuals in humanitarian crises are the scale for action, and that scale only makes sense in relation to national or international actors. This is the weird mouse.
An ergonomic mouse, that's why.
This is locally led, and that's the global. Transfer off. I think I'm good.
Okay, it's your round.
Sorry. Not made for my hand. Yeah, that one, thank you. So in this approach, what happens is that whenever there's some kind of humanitarian emergency, Christian Aid works through its partner network to produce or to distribute a series of micro grants to community-based organisations or to individuals to disperse. It's an approach that has been substantiated with empirical evidence to show that cash transfers in times of humanitarian crisis and its settings have a string of other positive impacts, for example, on child health. Next slide. So that second example then is of direct cash transfers in national development policy. So these are often transfers that are made to people within a country, so that becomes the scale. And the example that we tend to commonly use, or the example that's often used, is pensions policy in South Africa as an example of a direct cash transfer. So this was a policy post-apartheid that brought predominantly Black South Africans into the social security net system, and because of the effects of living with apartheid, people tend to die at an earlier age. And so this became a means of distributing income within the country. And so by giving a pension to pensionable age folks, it became a way of actually supplementing household income, because pensioners never spent the money on themselves. So it was a form of distribution. And that chart just shows how South African pensions were spent. And so they were spent on household food more than anything else. It was a way of poverty alleviation and addressing inequality from the 90s onwards. The role of these kinds of unconditional cash transfers are pretty well established. They tend to have, or they're evaluated as having a positive correlation to child and maternal health outcomes and educational outcomes in all of these reviews. The third example, the third scale, looks at the nation as the scale. The nation is the recipient, and in budget support, slightly old-fashioned way of thinking about aid and aid disbursement, but budget support and swaps, sector-wide approaches. And in that, the nation as a local scale and as a local recipient of direct cash only makes sense because there is a wealthier body of nations that is giving the money. So in these swaps and in direct budget support, this is where aid donors transferred funds straight into national treasuries, or had a specific budget line where they would have a swap for health or a swap for education, and then that ministry would determine how that money is spent. And these aid mechanisms, I'm calling them locally led development because decisions on policy and spend were locally held. And they were lauded for many things, but especially their financial and administrative efficiency gains, because that's what countries could then work with. And this very old report from ODI And you can tell probably from the typeface that it's a little bit old, but it was it's still a good report, I think. What it found in this technical evaluation was that there were many gains to be had from budget support and from use of swaps, not least inefficiency. And in the technical evaluations, the only criticism was for potential fiduciary and political risk of mismanagement of funds. But there was also a loss of donor profile if it couldn't brand it, if it went straight into the ministry. The fourth illustration is probably one that's a little bit of our times and might be more relevant to folks in this room. And it's quite a live area of looking at locally led approaches where there is partnership-based subcontracting. So I'm going to not just call it partnership-based, I'm going to call it partnership-based subcontracting, because I think that's often what it actually is. And this becomes the battleground for long-term unrestricted funding arrangements, i.e. the local partner wanting a cash transfer to spend money however they wish to spend money. And I expect you're all familiar with the arguments of partnership as locally led development, but here the partner is still made local in relation to the contracting partner, who tends to be the global or tends to be the international. It is the global or the international partner who sets the terms and conditions and the legal standards for reporting and risk. So what is happening in these formulations of locally led? Now, what's common across all of those examples that I've given of locally led development through direct cash transfers is that the local gets fixed in a territory. Now, that territory is either the nation state or it's people in specific sites, as Lata alluded to also in her presentation. And as local actors fixed in space, what is implied is that they lack worldliness, they lack cosmopolitanism, and they lack the possibility of being more than local, when being local is relationally to not be global. So if specific places and people are made local through development activities, then how are other people and other places made global? Can you click on the next one? So how do northern NGOs, so maybe our employers in this case, how do they encourage or implicitly command dependence and acclaim at being global? And I'm not asking for motivations, I'm not turning to why yet, but how do they do this? And I think you know all of the things that I'm going to pop up here. They hold the money. They hold the money and they decide how much to where, when, and on what conditions. They hold the power to turn off the tap, the most powerful power of all, I would say, in these kinds of arrangements. And this is the lesson learned from budget support. When the politics of being accountable to British taxpayers, whatever the truth, actually took hold and ended budget support as an idea. Next. They hold the power to walk away without real consequence. I want to put forward my own reason why. I think it's because locally led development approaches and activities have always been conceived and sold as technocratic solutions to technical problems, like cutting transaction costs, like positing that local people through their local identity know best for local activities without ever unpacking any of it. Achieving grand bargain ambitions of cash, localization, and participation all coming together. This makes locally led approaches apolitical and aideological, i.e. without ideology. So within cash transfers as locally led approaches, the questions I'd much rather we ask are what socialist, or dare I even say Marxist ideas of material distribution are being mobilized in this talk of locally led anything? What theory of radical solidarity? What ideas of deep democracy? When we're talking about decision-making, to me that triggers ideas of deep democracy. So what actual ideas of deep democracy are being practiced? And what politics of decolonisation is being mobilised? Decolonisation, as we know, can become this thing, this pot that we just chuck our ideas in. But there are multiple theories of decolonisation. So which one are you attaching yourselves to or not? So looking at various studies commissioned by donors, aid agencies, NGOs, and academics, I can't find the answer in any of that. Maybe you can, maybe you know, but I hope we can have a discussion about it at some point. So then how can locally led approaches re-engage with the decolonial approach, which is the question that Sophie asked me to engage with? And I'm going to do a very horrible thing and answer it with a question. Well, where's the political? And that question on where is the political underlies another incredibly important question. How do development interventions not recreate the conditions that they're trying to end? So how do locally led approaches not recreate the conditions of extractive relations, grossly inequitable movements of labor and capital, all packaged up in, dare I say, a thin veneer of morality around locally led? So my answer to this is to re-inject the political in direct cash transfers. Whether they are efficient or a suitable technical solution to the problem of disbursement doesn't and shouldn't matter. Direct cash transfers as reparations, in the kinds of work that Bria is leading and really driving in thoughtful ways, direct cash transfers as reparations is what gives such approaches an ideological purpose, which is what gives us all the language to push back against other ideological moves, including the one to frame development and its solutions in purely technocratic ways. So without the politics, locally led development appears to be yet another technical solution to a set of technical problems defined and actioned by the same old global actors who mark themselves as global and worldly by making the local a reified special site for their intervention. One slide. So Lata and I spoke about what we wanted to leave you with. So this is a common message from the two of us. It's useful to think of this as a political commitment. And as a political commitment, it's a choice. You don't have to do it. You don't have to be locally led anything. You don't have to decolonize. It's a choice. And we think, when we spoke about this together, that the choice was easy to make 2 years ago, when everyone else was talking about decolonizing, when everyone else was talking about anti-racism, when the discourse was everywhere, and every one of our employees was under pressure to at least put decolonization on an agenda, maybe at least put together a committee to talk about it a little bit more and look at solutions. But now that your committees are probably disbanded, now that the person that set up the agenda has probably left, what now? When the choice becomes more obvious and harder to make as a choice. So when resources are now harder to come by, because decolonization is no longer a novel activity and is no longer an urgent activity because it's been around for 2 years, what now? And so the question we'd like to leave you with is this one. As individuals going into the next set of discussions that GADN has planned for us, why is it important for you to be thinking about decoloniality at all? Remembering it's a choice. You don't have to.
Thank you. I think those are some really pertinent questions to leave us all with. And just whilst I just very briefly also now just use this time to also kind of connect the dots with what Kamna and Lata was saying with how GADN is conceptualizing this work on decolonization through our reframe work. I think that that's a really important question for you to continue to think and ponder over. So very briefly, I just wanted to kind of explain to you how GADN is thinking through this issue of decolonization, specifically through our framing or reframing feminist economic, macro level economics program. That's not to say that our reframe program is the only way in which we work on decolonization, but it's perhaps a helpful example that I think might be useful. So next slide, please. So I think we've already mentioned it before, but our reframe program aims to promote feminist economic alternatives by working with allies around the world to support global feminist movements and influence international decision makers. So that's what the reframe program aims to do. And specifically, you might ask, and we get this question a lot as an organization that is focused on as a gender network, why do you work on macro level economics? What's that got to do with gender? And I think it's really, it's a good question to ask. But I think for us, very much at GADN, is that we see that decisions that are taken by governments and regional and international institutions, they are critical in shaping the ways in which our economies are structured, how resources are raised, how they're allocated, and are therefore, they're absolutely central to the question of perpetuating patriarchy and inequality and the abuse of rights. So we see this question of economics as a fundamental component of how you resource rights, and specifically how you resource women's rights. And so with that being said, how does GADN understand this question of decolonisation? And it's not to give you the perfect catch-all definition that this is what decolonisation means for us, but I think it's a helpful framing, perhaps, of how we conceptualize it. And for us, it's very much the practice of recognizing, making visible, and addressing the legacies that colonialism, empire, racism, and patriarchy continue to have around the world. So we use that as kind of the frame, if you like, to understand what we mean by decolonization and the things that we're aiming to address as part of that work. So you may very well ask then, why does GADN focus on decolonization? What is it in it for us, especially taking into consideration the points that Kamna left us with? And I think for us, and for many of your organizations as well, I would argue, is that we recognize that the UK's colonial past has absolutely fundamentally shaped the nature of aid and the power dynamics between the UK and countries across the global south. I think we fundamentally recognize that point. And we can't also neglect the fact that race and neocolonialism continue to shape the current realities of people all around the world, especially across the global south, not to mention people of color, Black people here within the UK as well. And so we recognize too that as the UK international development sector is a product of colonialism and an active participant in perpetuating neocolonialism. So we actively are working to be part of the solution rather than saying that we will perpetuate this problem. So this is why for us as GADN, we have recognized that decolonization is a central element of the work that we do in addressing gender equality, and especially absolutely fundamentally linked to this question of macro level economics, global macro level economics. So if we move on to the next slide, just very briefly, what are the main ways that GADN works on decolonization through Reframe program? I just want to stress two particular ways, and this is simplifying it because there's lots of other stuff that we do, but it's two things. So it's the what we do and how we do it. So the what looks at the substantive program work with deliverables, if you like, and how we do it is the ways in which we work with organizations, movements, feminist movements around the world. Next slide, please. So in terms of our program work, I think one of the biggest pieces is that we work to influence the international norms of discourse on macro level economics, especially with the UK government, given the disproportionate and historic influence it has in global economic decision making. So with that, we focus our work on the FCDO, we focus our work on the Labour Party, we focus our work on the G7, really trying to make sure that whatever interventions that we have within those critical spaces, where the UK obviously has a big role, a big, huge influence, in shaping international economic decision-making, that we're able to use those lenses through which we can talk about the question of decolonization. What does a decolonized macro level economics look like? What could the UK's role be as part of decolonizing decision-making at the global level? So we use all of these various spaces that we work in to push these key messages around decolonization. I would also say that one of the other areas that we have been working on, especially with Priya in the back there, is the question around reparations. And I think for us, and as many of you may be familiar with, if you're not, we have a great briefing on our website, you can also check out. But I think the question of reparations is increasingly becoming a key issue for debate within current global discussions on global governance. Especially as a way to remedy past wrongs, but also as a way to kind of look at how you can create sustainable, equitable, fair futures. And for us, as part of the work that we do on combining gender and macroeconomics, reparations is a key entry point for us at GADN, and we're looking at that. And so whilst, of course, the exact nature of reparations, how that reparations needs to take place, will be shaped and determined by the various groups that have been harmed, I think we have to look at our role here as UK-based organisation. What is our contribution to this discourse on reparation? And I think for us, it's very much that we have to hold our own government to account here, especially in the case, to account for these past wrongs, these past harms, but also the ones that it's currently perpetuating. And so this, I think, for us is very much about creating the necessary enabling environment here in the UK context to be able to make sure that a UK government that comes into place accepts and understands the question on reparation. So it's not for us to come up with the demands, but just to create the space. And I think that we all have the capacity to do that within our respective organizations through the advocacy work that we do, through the potentially the ways in which we lobby the UK government. And just two more slides, just this, in terms of ways of working, the ways in which we work with others, I've listed a few examples here, but we've also produced a paper. This is a huge plug for the GADN website. Keep going there, everyone. Get our numbers up. We produced this paper back in 2022, which is titled, "What is the Role of Northern Organizations in Global Justice Advocacy?" And there we really kind of talked to a variety of different actors around the world, especially Southern feminists and organizations, really interrogating the ways in which our relationships work out. And some of the ways in which we're trying to use a decolonial approach through our ways of working is making sure that we're always centering the expertise and analysis of Southern women's rights organizations and feminists, which I think many of you in varying ways are doing. We're also seeking to address and correct epistemic injustices, fancy word for basically saying that Southern actors and voices have habitually been systematically erased. And so therefore, how can we make sure that we use the power that we have here at GADN to amplify those perspectives, those analysis? And also identifying spaces and opportunities for us to hear analysis from Southern organizations and groups, rather than continued consultations with them to say, tell us what you think, tell us what you think. So every single organization goes to the same Southern organizations to say, tell us what you think, tell us what you think, tell us what you think, tell us what you think. Find alternative ways to be able to hear from them. But also, I think this question about remuneration is absolutely fundamental, which is pay people for their time, respect the expertise that they have, the analysis that they provide, and also supporting the work of global feminist movements for us is absolutely fundamental. So looking at networks like the Global Alliance for Tax Justice, the African Feminist Macro Economics Academy, the Gender and Trade Coalition, the Women's Rights Coalition, finding what ways in which you can support those kinds of feminist networks is something that is fundamental to our work as the ways in which we work. And also, as I said before, using our power and influence to amplify Southern analysis and perspectives with UK decision makers and the UK government. So these are just some of the examples of the ways in which we work as compared to what we do. I think this is the final slide, Yelena. What makes this... Wrap it up. The final slide, I just want to say, what is it that makes this possible for us at GADN is that we have a brilliant board who I want to give a high five to, all of you who are here, but we also have a GADN strategy that basically enables us to do some of this work. And so if you look at this, again on the GADN website, if you look at $3.99, everyone go check it out. If you look at the first aim there, and if you click again this third aim here, I would say are the two big areas of our GADN strategy that basically give us the license to be able to work on decolonisation. And I think that is a really, especially when you're thinking of all the various different ways in which you can do this work, it needs that anchoring or some kind of ways in which that you can underpin this work that you're doing. And so for us, that has been, we've discussed religiously with the board, and these are the two particular aims within the strategy, I think, that really speak to our work on decolonisation through our macro level economics work. But we also do that across all varieties of our work with members and internally and so on. So yeah, I'll stop there. So with that being said, everyone, and I know that time is running short, I want to give us about 7-ish minutes for a Q&A. So if you have any questions that you would like to pose to our speakers, please raise your hand. And also to say to those of you online, if there are any questions that you do have, if you could put it in the chat, and then Yamina, you can kindly read those out for us. So we can use this time really for clarifying questions, but there will be opportunities in the breakout group that follows that we can discuss some of these questions. Thank you, Gillian. So we've got 3 questions, and I'll come back for a second round, everyone. So there's questions around accountability. Where does accountability lie? Why did it take the killing of one Black man, George Floyd, to ignore decades of work that's been done on decolonisation across the global South? And then the broader point that Gideon was making on the philosophy and swaps that and what led to changes in the aid sector. So who would like to start with the accountability?
Sure. So first, thank you for all those thoughtful questions. Knees crack. I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, one of the things I remember sharing with students once was this, I think, this interview on Radio 4 with a Tory politician whose name escapes me, but we've been quite deliberate in sort of saying, well, look, we have UK aid, and we owe it to the UK taxpayer to be clear about how we're spending money and are we getting good value for money. And it wouldn't just be this person. I mean, this is the way that works. And I think we get really stuck because it's very difficult to make different demands, because it goes back to the point you made about who's controlling the purse strings. And so we're always sitting in tension with sort of the language of more progressive sort of outcomes, or we're really committed to localization, but nobody wants to actually give up that control. One of the things that I think then is really valuable about a space like this is I do think that there is a way of telling different stories about value for money, or different stories about accountability. And collectively, if as a sector we said, look, whether you actually mean it or not, I'm going to take it your word that you want value for money. But if you want value for money, UK taxpayers are just not in the frame. That is not where the accountability lies, because all you're going to do is you're going to keep spending money to pretend to solve problems as opposed to actually solving them. And collectively in this sector, there's lots of experience and lots of insight into what that looks like. But I do think it has to be a collective demand, because even if it's about the sector using its soft power, using its power, which is the way that the UK projects soft power through aid, we need to push that back at them and say, okay, if we're your conduit for the expression of that soft power, then this is the way we're going to work. And I think there is room for that. I fully appreciate that making that demand of sort of, the holders of the purse strings is quite hard. And I have been in those meetings where actually you just get that head shake where it's just like, well, no, we refuse to allow you to say that, or we refuse to publish that. So obviously that exists. But in academia, we have the same sort of problem. We're always writing like impact statements. And I just want to scream and go, I haven't even done the work yet. Why on earth are you asking me to talk about impact? It's a completely... So there are ways that collectively we have to raise our voices and say, look, actually, if you're serious about this, then accountability, we have to look at this question differently. That also needs a historical context, which actually goes back to the point about BLM, and then I'll stop because the question of the swap thing is interesting, and I'm really curious what you're going to say. But it's absolutely right. And I have to say, I have and continue to be very wary of situating the murder of George Floyd as the starting point of this, because it is deeply disrespectful to, as you quite rightly know, centuries of activism of people making the point about the carcerality of whether it's border regimes or economic systems or policing systems, and the fact that the violence that begets on certain types of othered bodies is a very, 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 is a centuries old kind of debate, but also activity that it becomes completely invisibilized. But I do think it would be churlish not to at least acknowledge that it did ignite something. And I think the simple reason is that it did happen in the US in front of a camera in a way that nobody could deny that it was anything other than racism. You couldn't watch that, and actually I didn't watch the video, I just couldn't do it. It was just it was so unbearably awful that it didn't, but I know what it has in it. And it wasn't anything else. There was no other way to explain what was happening to that man apart from a deep-seated racist hatred. And so you could no longer look away when people said, see, this is what we've been talking about for centuries. But I agree that centering that event is in danger of invisibilizing the centuries of work that people have done and continue to do. And I'm all up for, bringing those sorts of efforts in. So for instance, you know, if we were teaching about coloniality, it's always really important to say, you know, let's talk about the Haitian Revolution. Let's think about, so that's why I think narratives and stories or histories are really, really important. How do we change the lens on how we tell these stories? And I think we can do that, and we can make different arguments. And I think the only way we can be stronger is if we make those arguments together. We raise our voices together and say, actually, no, that's it. We're not going to do it this way anymore. Or we're not going to tell that story this way anymore. Actually, we've got a better way to tell that story. And, you know, I think we've gotten somewhere, but it feels like, you know, one step forward, two steps back sort of thing. Or 4 steps back, indeed, yeah.
Thank you. And Kamna.
Oh, you want me to be quick?
Yes, very quick, please.
Okay, I'll be very quick. I want to pick up on your question about starting with George Floyd. And I want to reflect on a paper that I cite quite a lot by somebody called Sarah White, who's a professor at the University of Bath, and she wrote a paper in 2002. And one bit of that paper said, race is silent in development scholarship and in development practice because it marks its centrality. The development project doesn't exist without racism. The development industry doesn't exist without racism. And so I do teach a class on decolonizing, on the discourse of decolonizing development at this time. And I start with Haiti and I go through to Bandung. But the point that I make is the distinction between this word development that becomes like a comfort blanket and the industry that we are a part of. And the industry is a messy marketplace with different actors all trying to get paid and all trying to sustain their business models. And in that development, it does start predominantly 2 years ago, because there is a wealth of incentive that sustains the industry by keeping silent on racism. If the development sector had no racism, there wouldn't be black and brown others to save. And then who's in a job and who's out of a job? Like fundamentally, I think that's what it comes down to. So I hope it's not disrespectful. I hope that it can be said in a way that actually acknowledges the political economy of the development industry and the actors that are paid within that industry and how they are paid and why they took notice 2 years ago should become the question. And so I don't think they should start their conversations with Bandung because they weren't around in Bandung. Or maybe they were in some way or other, but where is that South-South cooperation now if they're centering themselves and regarding themselves as the node through which their local partners come together? That's still centering themselves. That's not South-South. Swaps, I took your point more as a comment than anything else. I find it fascinating that when we come back to talking about budget support and swaps, and I should say that before I was an academic, I worked in consultancy for a number of years, and about 20 years ago was involved in developing a swap for Rwanda. So I do remember some of that language, and I remember the primacy that was given to discourses of corruption at the time, being slightly troubled by it then, being even more troubled by it now, and the ways in which we might be attentive to what counts as corruption in some places and not at others, particularly during, you know, anyone paying attention to PPEs going missing a lot in the UK. So there is a problem with packaging analysis of swaps and budget support, even now, that I think feeds into maybe some risky tropes about which governments can be trusted with money and which governments can't. And I don't think that budget support or swaps were ever conceived as the only aid modality. They were one of many. And so those civil society concerns about propping up despotic governments or something like that are relevant and valid, but that was never the totality of aid. I always saw it as something that brought the Paris Declaration and Busan to life. It was a way of cooperation and reducing transaction costs, which is the point I was trying to make. It was sold as technical, much more so than the political project it could have been, and some version of it could still exist as a political project, even if it looks a bit different to how it would have done 20 years ago, 15 years ago.
Thank you. So I know I did say that I'm going to come back to you, so I just wanted to say that. And then just briefly, because I know we had quite a few really interesting questions that were asked, and it feels a bit remiss not to be able to answer them or use this opportunity now in the next last 5-ish minutes to answer some of those questions. So I'm going to kick us off and raise those questions that we heard from the beginning. So there was a question around shifting the power and the FCDO's engagement or involvement in it, how we understand global South, global North boundaries, those distinctions, funding feminist movements and any lessons, good or bad, from them. And there was a final question on the different ways in which global North organizations have experience, if there was experiences of addressing other forms of power that INGOs have beyond just financial resources. What other different other forms of power that we have? So who would like to start on any one of those 4 questions?
I just want to take maybe one of them.
Okay, sure, that's fine.
Natalia's question on the geographical boundaries of global North and global South. It's a question geographers have been asking for decades and decades and decades. And what I find useful to think of is the idea of the global South as a way of thinking, not as a territorial space. And as a way of thinking, what it represents is marginality, I think. And so speaking from places of marginality, what are the boundaries of that? There isn't really a geographical boundary of that. And that I think that allows us to imagine global Souths within the so-called global North and global North within the so-called global South, because we're speaking of margins. But I think where that comes into tension in very specific and real and material ways is in the development sector, where there is a global South. And so for there, I think the pushback is not how to think from the global South, but how to think through marginality.
Thank you. Lata, anyone?
Yeah, I mean, on this question of just also on the global South, and it kind of comes back to, I guess, the point of why we're here today. I actually think the lens of coloniality is really helpful because it's very clarifying in terms of, who has power and why. So when we think about, as I said, I mentioned it, but it's worth, again, reflecting, sort of thinking about, the language that we work in. And here I don't just mean like English, but this is a bugbear of mine, but I say that as somebody who uses it all the time, so I'm guilty as charged. But anyway, but the particular professionalized English that allows you to participate in this space. And that closes off the way that we can know. And so, but also on the point of, how we can also maybe unsettle the global South. Because I agree with you completely. I think, it's the notion of marginality. But to go back to your point, Susie, about the Bandung, because I don't think we ever really talked about that. There are new global South alliances obviously emerging in ways that I think we also need to be attendant to, that are using the language of global South and the fact that it's a signifier of marginality and then behaving in what we might consider to be deeply problematic ways. And I don't say that because they're in or of the global South, but they're behaving in ways that we might say, whether that's about oppressing their own internal populations, but then saying, okay, but we're the global South, and so you can't really tell us what to do because, we're marginalized, and so we're not going to take any lessons from the UK, which may be a fair point. But the fact is, there are countries that are behaving in that way. We know, huge kind of issues in India and Sri Lanka and Brazil, and, and Colombia is only coming out of that with the new elections, but that was also an issue. So you have this sense that actually, and even now Uganda with the anti-LGBTQ law. So there's things that we can think about where actually part of the pushback is, we don't want the colonizers to tell us what to do anymore. So then how do we actually critique when in a way we can also see that that's kind of a reasonable position, that we don't want to be told what to do. But those sorts of alliances are emerging as well. I'm really sorry. What was I don't think I had anything else to add.
Sure. So there was on Shift the Power and the FCDO, funding feminist movements and lessons, and are there other ways in which global North organizations have forms of power? So I could also answer some of those.
I was going to say, I think actually those are great questions for you to answer, but thank you for the questions. Really great.
So I think just really briefly, because there was a question online from Cecilia who said, I wanted to know if there were experiences of addressing other forms of power that INGOs have beyond financial resources. So to plug that GADN paper again, that's why we're here. On what is the role of global North organizations in global justice advocacy, there is a term that we use in that paper called global North power and privilege, and it tries to encapsulate, of course it's not exhaustive, but the different ways in which global north organizations have power beyond just money, but from your worldview, from the values that we have, the resources that we get, our access to decision makers, especially like the UK government, etc. So that's a paper I would refer folks to have a look at. And then just on the question on shifting the power in FCDO, I think many of us will have seen that there was a Shift the Power conference in Bogota in December. Some of you might have been in attendance. There's also initiatives that are coming up like Pledge for Change, the FCDO is absolutely involved in. There are initiatives like Ringo as well that many of you will have seen, again, on shifting the power. But I guess the one question that I would ask, especially in light of the conversations that we've been having today, is the absence of a politicized agenda in any of those spaces. So a lot of them continue to, if I may very respectfully say, go for the low-hanging fruit. So nobody is going to object to you saying that, of course, we should center the experiences of people across the global south in the development policy and development programming that we do in our interventions. It's inoffensive. Nobody is going to say no to you on those fronts, right? So I think the conversation then becomes overly focused on that, as opposed to the broader, bigger question about the ways in which the UK government in particular, given that we're here, the role that it plays in perpetuating a lot of the violence and a lot of the problems that we're witnessing across the global south. So I think it's a very convenient distraction from the bigger question at hand, and it's easier to do. And I know that there are some of us who are at the conference. I don't know if you have any insights, Lena, that you can share from the Shift the Power.
Yeah, so I was in Bogota, and I think that the involvement of FCDO and Hilton and the conveners of the Shift the Power movement, the Global Community Foundations, has done a great job in trying to bring along funders, but the FCDO was not in Bogota. And there were other funders there, but we did have a question at the conference on the first day, which was, do we think the right actors are in the room to actually shift power? And everyone said no. Like the majority of people said no. So it was a wonderful thing to have the space. It's really great to have space. The Shift the Power movement, I mean, I wonder, like, it is a movement, but it's not an organization. It's around the world, that it isn't organized, but it's not supposed to be. It's supposed to be able to give like fertile ground for different shoots to be able to come in different ways so that we can share and learn. But at some point that does have to then cross over to the actual sector and system that we're working in. And so the FCDO weren't at the last conference. I know the donors who were there were very much, it wasn't about, we're going to mark you, this is about like you saying what you're going to change. The real objective of them being there was about, you need to come and hear where grassroots movements are at the moment. We need to come and hear and listen, and that was a lot of the funders at that time.
And then there was a final question from Emily on funding feminist movements, any lessons, good or bad. So GADN doesn't work exclusively in this area, and I know Disha, Womankind, some of your experiences might be helpful here, not to put you on the spot to answer this question, but I think for me, the way in which what I think might be helpful, and especially I think something that you said, Kamna, was to how you can conceptualize this funding for women's rights organizations as a form of reparations, and not even just to say, and don't get me wrong, the amount of money that's going to women's rights organizations is still absolutely minuscule. It's still absolutely, it's not flexible enough. It doesn't address some of their core work that they're doing. But I think it's this politicizing of why you're doing this. For me, I feel that feels like a really helpful way to start the conversation around like the reparations analysis, to bring that kind of discourse into the ways in which the FCDO thinks about its work. And I think for us as GADN, for example, with the reparations work, it is this longer term strategy about how you get reparations on the UK government's agenda and how you normalize the discourse around it. And this might be one of the ways in which you can encapsulate it. But there might be other experiences that others are able to share or in response to Emily's questions on good or bad lessons learned on funding feminist movements.
I'm just going to add, sure. If you're going to be circulating any resources afterwards, we can sort of share. I think you mentioned a lot of readings that I think would be interesting to colleagues. But the OECD DAC, I don't know if you've seen it, the GenderNet has just released the statistics about funding for women's rights, gender equality, and it's fallen substantially. And so, I mean, if I can, I followed a link that broke, so I haven't had time to look for the correct one, but there is a report that's outlining that. I'm happy to share it if that would be helpful to all of you, just to see it, so I can share it with you and send it out on the notices. Yes, I'll share that. Thank you. But yeah, not good news at all. Literally like 3 days ago. And unsurprising. Thank you, Lata. Okay. With that being said, we are now at time, or past time, some might say. So thank you everybody for